Hey there, welcome back. Tonight, we're retaking a quiet journey to a place that once shimmered beneath the southern Italian sun, a city of marble courtyards, painted walls, and laughter that drifted through narrow streets. Tonight, we're stepping into Pompeii, just before the ash fell. So let's slow down, breathe a little, and take a closer look at what life was really like in this Roman town before time itself turned to stone. Before we begin, I'd like to share something small. If you enjoy these calm journeys through history, consider liking the video or subscribing, only if you really enjoy it. And while you're here, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I love imagining this invisible web of people falling asleep to the same quiet stories. The morning light over Pompeii was gentle, pale gold spilling across rooftops of terracotta. From the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, vines clung to the soil, heavy with grapes. Farmers in simple tunics worked the land with practiced rhythm, unaware that the earth beneath them breathed in its own slow way. Ancient, waiting. Down in the city, life began with the sound of footsteps, sandals clicking against stone, a chorus of merchants calling out their wares, the bray of donkeys pulling carts filled with bread, figs, and olive oil. The air was thick with scents, fresh loaves, crushed grapes, wet limestone from the fountains. Water ran through narrow channels carved centuries earlier, feeding public baths and private homes. Everywhere there was color, deep reds, ochres, sea blue pigments painted onto plaster walls. Even the poorest shopfront carried some trace of artistry, a mural, a carving, a fragment of myth turned into decoration. Pompeii was alive with texture and sound, with the ordinary beauty of repetition. In the central forum, the heart of the city beat quietly beneath marble colonnades. Citizens gathered to trade, gossip, and argue about grain prices or the next festival. Priests lit incense before statues of Jupiter and Venus, the smoke curling upward into a sky so clear it seemed eternal. No one looked twice at the mountain beyond, its slopes covered in green, its silence mistaken for peace. To the people of Pompeii, Vesuvius was simply part of the horizon, as fixed as the gods themselves. By midday, the baths filled with laughter and steam. Men and women drifted between rooms of heat and coolness, their skin glistening with oil and mineral water. Marble benches echoed with conversations about harvests, politics, and love affairs. Outside, in shaded courtyards, families gathered for lunch, lentils, bread, a bit of fish, and sweet wine from nearby vineyards. Children played with small clay dolls or chased each other along the mosaic floors. It was a world suspended between simplicity and splendor, a city both ordinary and perfect in its stillness. Inside the villas, frescoes told stories of heroes and gods. Walls glowed with color, crimson fields where satyrs danced, golden temples floating among clouds. The wealthy reclined on couches, listening to the soft notes of a lyre, while servants poured wine from bronze jugs that caught the light. Even the smallest gestures, a hand brushing against a bowl of figs, the flicker of a lamp, carried the sense of permanence. No one imagined how fragile it all was. And yet, the earth sometimes murmured. Tiny tremors shook the foundations of houses, rattling cups and doors. People laughed them off. The gods are stirring, they would say. After all, small earthquakes were not rare in Campania. Still, dogs barked at nothing, wells grew strangely low, and the air near the mountain carried a faint scent of sulfur that clung to the evening breeze. But life went on. It always did. As the sun lowered, Pompeii turned soft again, streets glowing with the warmth of fading day. Oil lamps flickered in doorways, laughter echoed from taverns. Lovers met in gardens shaded by cypress trees. Poets recited verses by candlelight. Somewhere, a baker pulled the last loaves from his oven and set them aside for morning. The smell of flour and smoke hung in the air like memory. If you walked those streets now, you'd hear the heartbeat of a world unaware of its own fragility. You'd see the chalk lines where merchants counted their coins, the graffiti scribbled in Latin jokes, the footsteps worn into marble thresholds. Every mark, every sound, every scent was a promise that tomorrow would come, as it always had. And above it all, the mountain watched, silent, patient. Its shadow stretched a little farther each evening. The night sky shimmered over Pompeii, unbroken and calm. From the villas by the sea, you could hear waves rolling softly against the shore. Somewhere, a child whispered a prayer to a household god before sleep, asking for good dreams and safe mornings. In the distance, a faint warmth pulsed beneath the soil, the slow breath of something ancient awakening. But the city slept, peaceful and unaware, its streets bathed in silver moonlight. Tomorrow would begin as every day before it had, with the sound of carts, the smell of bread, and the laughter of those who believed they had time. Morning rose pale and ordinary. A faint mist lay over the vineyards, and the streets still smelled of bread and wet stone. Vendors began their calls, voices bouncing between walls that had heard them 1,000 times before. The air was softer than usual, though, heavier somehow, as if the day had woken from a strange dream. No one could name what felt wrong. Even the dogs at the gate seemed restless, their tails low, their eyes fixed toward the north. At first came a murmur. It was so small that people mistook it for thunder from the distant sea. Jugs trembled on shelves. A fountain stream shifted sideways for a heartbeat. Somewhere, a pot cracked in a kitchen, and laughter followed, the sound of something trivial. But then it came again, deeper this time, like the growl of an enormous creature beneath the earth. Birds rose suddenly from the vineyards, swirling into the pale light like dark smoke. By mid-morning, the ground began to breathe. Tiles slipped from roofs. Windows rattled in their frames. In the Forum, a statue of Mercury tilted slightly, its bronze foot lifted as if to step away. People looked at one another, some frightened, others smiling awkwardly, pretending the world was still steady. "Just another tremor," someone said. "The mountain always sighs." And yet, the air smelled faintly of burning, a bitter tang that stung the throat. Then, without warning, the mountain opened its mouth. A column of black and fire shot upward into the blue. It rose in silence for a heartbeat, so vast that even the wind seemed to stop to watch. Then came the sound, a single roar that shook the ribs, that turned sky into storm. Windows shattered, birds vanished. Across the Bay of Naples, people later said it was like hearing the world split apart. Ash began to fall, slowly at first, like a soft gray snow. Children laughed, catching it in their hands before their mothers pulled them inside. But the flakes thickened, and soon the sky dimmed. Daylight thinned to a strange yellow, and a shadow fell across the streets. People gathered in doorways, staring upward, unsure whether they were witnessing punishment or wonder. Some prayed, others ran for the fields. The air was filled with a hiss, as though rain were falling on fire. Hour by hour the eruption grew. The black plume rose miles high, curling at its crown like a giant pine tree made of smoke. From its heart, lightning flickered in unnatural colors: violet, green, white. Ash rained thicker, mixing with pumice stones that clattered against tiles and shoulders. The noise never stopped, a deep rolling thunder that came from every direction at once. People covered their faces with cloth, but the dust crept in through every crack, every breath. In the amphitheater, where crowds once shouted for gladiators, the benches were empty. Only pigeons moved there now, white feathers turning gray. In the streets, carts overturned, oxen broke free, and the fountains overflowed with muddy water. The city's pulse, the rhythm of hammers, of markets, of laughter, began to slow. Voices called for gods whose temples were already dark with falling soot. By afternoon, the sea retreated. Fishermen watched from the shore as the tide pulled back unnaturally far, leaving boats stranded on the sand. They did not yet understand that the sea itself was recoiling from what was coming. The sky, once golden blue, turned black as ink. Even the sun disappeared, smothered by smoke. Only the red glow of the mountain remained, a furnace at the edge of sight. In that dim light, people began to flee. They wrapped their faces with scarves, carried small idols or jars of water. Parents clutched children. Lovers refused to part. Some headed toward the gates, but the roads were already choked with ash. The air was so thick it rasped when they spoke. Each breath tasted of stone. The first roofs collapsed at dusk. Timbers groaned. Tiles slid down in slow cascades. The streets filled with cries and the sound of distant bells. From the upper floors of villas, flames flickered where oil lamps had fallen. The scent of burning linen and cedar mingled with sulfur and dust. It was no longer possible to tell where the mountain ended and the city began. And yet, even in terror, the human heart searches for meaning. A mother pressed her child close and whispered that the gods would soon forgive them. An old man tried to gather scrolls from his library, as if words might outlive the fire. A baker stood before his oven one last time, staring at the loaves rising within, as though the act of waiting might hold back the dark. When night came, it was not darkness but absence. The stars were gone, the sky itself had vanished. Only the mountain glowed, a vast pillar of fire twisting upward into nothingness. Every sound was swallowed except the falling of ash, steady, soft, endless. It coated hair, skin, stone, memory. The city, once bright with color and song, now moved only in whispers and footsteps muffled by dust. Those who looked back saw the last shape of their home dissolve behind them. Walls disappeared into smoke. The forum vanished, and above it all, the roar continued, unceasing, merciless, strangely beautiful. It was the sound of creation in reverse. Somewhere near the edge of the city, a man turned toward the sea and saw lightning crawling across the black waves. He thought of his garden, of the olive trees heavy with fruit, and for a moment he almost smiled. Then he kept walking into a horizon that no longer held a sky. Part 3. Fire in the air. The night no longer belonged to the stars. What hung above Pompeii was something heavier, a ceiling of ash and fire that pulsed and flickered like the inside of a furnace. The mountain's roar had become constant, a living sound, deep and uneven, as though the world itself was breathing too fast. Every heartbeat in the city followed that rhythm. The wind carried grit that stung the skin, and the air was so hot that each breath felt stolen rather than given. In the streets, torches flickered weakly against the storm. People moved like shadows through the falling ash, wrapped in cloaks, pressing cloths to their faces. They tried to find each other's voices but could barely hear over the rumbling sky. The stone streets, once shining in the daylight, were buried under a growing blanket of gray. Steps disappeared, fountains overflowed with mud. The familiar map of Pompeii, the baths, the temples, the market stalls, had turned into a blurred memory. At first, many believed the end would pass quickly. They whispered that the gods were angry, but would soon be appeased. A few priests climbed the temple steps to pray, their silhouettes trembling in the red light. They offered incense, but the smoke vanished instantly into the storm, swallowed by greater fire. Inside homes, people knelt before their household shrines, touching small figures of the Lars, the guardian spirits of family and hearth. Some whispered their children's names again and again, as if sound alone could anchor them to life. By midnight, pumice stones rained in waves. They struck the ground with hollow sounds, bouncing once before settling into heaps. Tiles shattered, walls began to lean. Ash gathered so quickly on rooftops that beams snapped under its weight. Those who dared step outside could barely see beyond an arm's length. The air was filled with grit that cut at the eyes, burned the throat, and turned every breath into pain. Flames flashed across the mountain, reflected in the bay below, a mirror of chaos on the dark water. Somewhere near the Villa of the Mysteries, a group of neighbors huddled in a wine cellar. They had brought water, bread, and a single lamp. Its light trembled against their faces, illuminating eyes filled with disbelief more than fear. One woman murmured that the god Vulcan was forging weapons for the end of the world. Another said it was simply nature, nothing divine, just the anger of the earth itself. They could hear the stones pounding above like the feet of invisible giants. And still, in that suffocating air, someone began to pray softly, not for survival, but for silence. In the forum, statues fell one by one. Jupiter's marble face split clean down the middle, and his nose crumbled into dust. Columns cracked and toppled with slow grinding sounds that carried across the empty square. Those who tried to flee toward Herculaneum found the roads impassable. The ash was knee-deep, and the air burned their lungs. Others turned back to the sea, hoping for rescue, only to find the shoreline unrecognizable. The water had drawn back again, leaving fish floundering on the sand. Thunder rolled from beneath their feet. The ground itself seemed to breathe. By the early hours, darkness had thickened into a living thing. It was not night anymore, but the absence of light, total, consuming. People moved by instinct, feeling walls and doors, guided by memory alone. Voices rose and vanished. Sometimes the sky flared white, revealing faces coated in ash, eyes wide and unseeing, before sinking back into red gloom. The temperature dropped suddenly as the plume stretched miles high. Cold wind from the upper air swept through the streets, carrying sulfur, smoke, and fear. In one house, a mother tried to protect her baby beneath a table. Ash seeped through the roof, settling on their hair like snow. She sang, a lullaby once meant to chase away nightmares. Now it was the only sound that still felt human. Outside, a horse screamed, trapped between fallen beams. Its echo joined the thunder, a terrible harmony that marked the hour. Somewhere else, a young man tried to dig through the pumice to reach his father, his hands bleeding, the air so thick he could hardly see. He shouted until his voice broke, but the mountain drowned him out. By dawn, the sky was still dark. The eruption had not stopped. It had only changed shape. Instead of fire, there came a new sound, a rushing wind, sharp and endless. The column above Vesuvius had grown unstable, folding in on itself. What rose into the heavens now began to fall back to earth, a rain of molten stone and ash, moving faster than the wind. It rolled down the mountain in waves, swallowing vineyards, trees, and everything in its path. From the city, it looked like a shadow descending. Those who saw it coming fell silent. There was no running from what filled the horizon, a wall of darkness moving as if it were alive. People clung to each other, turned toward the gods, or simply closed their eyes. They could not know that this was only the first surge of what would come, that the air itself would soon turn solid. But in that moment, as the sound of the world's ending drew closer, something inside them shifted from fear to stillness. Acceptance, perhaps, or awe. The ash fell thicker now, soft, steady, endless. It buried footprints as soon as they were made. It covered faces, erased colors, muted every sound except the beating of the heart. The mountain, still glowing red at its core, looked almost beautiful from a distance, a vision of another world. And as people huddled in cellars and courtyards, their lamps dimming, they whispered the same thought again and again. That morning might never come, yet somehow they wished to see it. Part 4. The Weight of Ash. By the time the second day began, Pompeii was no longer a city. It was a sound. A low, endless rumble beneath the feet, above the head, inside the ribs. Each tremor shook the air loose from its place. The streets had vanished under drifts of pumice that reached the windows, and every breath carried the taste of smoke. Those who still moved through the ruins did so like ghosts, muffled by cloth and fear. The ash came not as flakes now, but as a rain of stone. Each fragment was warm to the touch, still glowing at its heart. It hissed when it struck the fountains, turning water to steam. The air shimmered with heat, the sky the color of iron. People no longer spoke in full voices. They gestured, coughed, whispered short prayers between gasps. Even the bravest among them began to realize the truth. There would be no escape from this. The roads were gone. The sea had turned its back, and the mountain's breath was everywhere. Inside the homes, families gathered where the roofs were strongest, under doorways, arches, cellars. Children slept in their mothers' arms, the dust settling on their faces like gray powder. In one villa, the master of the house sealed the door with a plank and wrote on the wall a single word before the lamp went out. Veil, farewell. The flame struggled, then died, leaving only the soft hiss of falling ash. It filled every room, every breath, every pause between thoughts. Hours passed in half-darkness. Daylight existed only as a dim silver glow through the haze, as if the sun had been buried too. When the wind shifted, the smell of sulfur grew sharp and metallic, coating tongues and throats. Coughs echoed in the courtyards, mixed with the creak of bending beams. The ash piled heavier on rooftops, pressing downward until the wood cracked like bones. One by one, the houses gave way, quietly at first, then with the groaning finality of surrender. In the forum, the last statues fell. They landed without ceremony, their marble faces shattering into silence. The temple columns leaned, fractured, and disappeared under layers of soot. Only the great stone pavements remained visible, and even they trembled beneath the shifting weight. Everywhere there was motion without life, sound without meaning. A deep wind carried ash through broken doors, piling it into soft hills where people once stood to argue, to laugh, to trade. Now there was only the hiss, the whisper, the settling dust. Down by the harbor, those who had reached the shore found the air no kinder. The sea had turned dark, flecked with floating pumice. Waves no longer sang against the sand. They slapped it instead, dull and heavy. Boats lay overturned, half buried in the gray. A group of fishermen built a small shelter from their oars and nets, waiting for the sky to clear, but it never did. The horizon was gone, erased. Even the mountains across the bay had vanished behind the curtain of ash. As the hours deepened, the weight above grew unbearable. Every step sank ankle-deep in powder that hissed like dry snow. Every breath scraped raw. People tied wet cloths around their faces, though the water soon turned black with soot. Many chose to stay indoors, believing the walls of their homes might protect them. But the mountain sent something new, a wind so fierce it rattled the city's bones. The ash it carried moved sideways now, filling doorways, sealing windows, erasing light. Somewhere near the house of the faun, a family gathered in their atrium. They had covered their mouths and eyes, and still they coughed blood. The eldest daughter held her father's hand. His lips moved without sound. She thought he was praying, but he was only breathing, shallow, rhythmic, fading. In the faint lamplight, the mosaics on the floor still gleamed, tiny colored stones depicting dancers, gods, triumphs. The beauty was unbearable now, too alive in a world that was ending. When the roof began to give, they didn't run. They simply drew closer. Farther inland, the mountain's fire glowed through the smoke, orange veins pulsing within black clouds. The ash fell faster, hotter. The air pressed down like a hand. Every sound, the cries, the cracking timber, the rushing wind, became one. Time stretched into something viscous, without direction. For those who remained alive, there was no before or after. Only this endless gray now, thick and heavy as thought. By evening, the streets were buried chest high. Pompeii was sinking in slow motion, its rooftops merging with the drifting ash. Here and there, the outlines of buildings rose like islands, silent monuments already half forgotten. The sky bled red through the smoke, a dull glow that flickered over statues and fallen beams. For a moment, it seemed as if the entire city was lit from within, burning not with fire, but with memory. In one of the bathhouses, a group of slaves huddled beside the furnace, thinking warmth would save them. But the heat grew unbearable, and the air turned thick. They clawed at the doors, only to find them sealed by the weight outside. When the final rush of ash broke through the roof, it came like a soft wave, quiet, almost gentle. It covered them where they stood, their outlines preserved by the dust that killed them. And still, above it all, the mountain breathed. The plume rose and fell, rising like a tide of stone. Its roar softened to a deep hum that could be felt more than heard. To those hidden below, that vibration was the pulse of the end, steady, inescapable. Ash settled thicker, pressing the world flat, muting even despair. The weight of it made the air itself solid. It turned motion into sculpture, fear into silence, life into the faint outline of what it once was. When darkness returned again, Pompeii no longer made a sound. The roofs had fallen, the torches were gone, and the voices had stilled. All that remained was the faint rustle of ash, like soft snow drifting in a world that would never thaw. Part 5. The last light. The world had narrowed to the space of a single breath. Each inhalation was a struggle against the heat, against the weight pressing down from above. Pompeii no longer knew where day ended or night began. The sky was a ceiling of dust that swallowed both. What light remained was not sunlight, but reflection, the dull orange glow of the mountain fire filtering through the falling ash. Every shape shimmered, half real, like memory seen through smoke. People moved through that twilight as if underwater. They reached for doorways that no longer stood, for streets erased by drifts of stone. Every sound seemed distant, wrapped in gauze, the cough of a dying animal, the clatter of tiles, the soft thud of bodies sinking into ash. Somewhere, a bell from a collapsed temple rang once, struck not by hand, but by falling debris. Its note hung in the air, longer than it should have, as if refusing to die. In the house of the tragic poet, the frescoes still glowed faintly. Scenes of myth, Achilles, Helen, the gods at feast, watched as their walls began to crack. A woman crouched beneath them, clutching a small bundle wrapped in linen, her child, silent now. The colors around her seemed to fade as the ash thickened, turning reds to rust, blues to gray. When the ceiling gave way, it came down like snow, soft and final. Within moments, the room was sealed. A tomb, painted with stories of beauty that outlived those who made them. Elsewhere, near the city gates, a group of men tried to clear a path. They used shovels, bowls, even their bare hands, flinging ash aside that returned faster than it left. Their voices broke into gasps. Their eyes watered until they could no longer see. One of them stopped and turned back toward the city. Through the haze he saw torches, faint and few, moving like fireflies. Then the wind shifted, and the torches vanished, swallowed whole. He dropped his shovel and whispered something. No one heard what, before the next tremor threw him to his knees. The dogs had long stopped barking. They lay curled beside doorways, their outlines soft beneath the settling ash. Cows in the field stood motionless, turned toward the mountain as if waiting for instruction. Even the birds that had once fled seemed gone from the world entirely. There was no horizon anymore, no distance, only the immediate, the suffocating now. In the amphitheater, where cheers once rolled like thunder, silence reigned. A few had taken shelter beneath the stone arches, believing the old walls would hold. They huddled close, listening to the steady patter of ash against the steps. One man recited a verse from memory, his voice shaking. Nothing endures but change. Another laughed, a short cracked sound, and answered, "Then we will endure the longest." No one replied. Moments later, the arches gave way, and the poem ended where breath did. Time lost its edges. Some thought hours had passed, others believed only minutes. The mountain flashed again, a burst of crimson lightning tearing through the column of smoke. It illuminated Pompeii for one brief heartbeat, the statues, the bodies, the roofs sinking into ash. For that instant, the city glowed with terrible beauty, as if the gods themselves had reached down to preserve it in fire. Then the darkness returned, thicker than before, pressing every sound flat. Down near the Stabian baths, the water boiled. Steam rose in pillars that met the falling ash halfway, creating clouds within clouds. Those who had sought warmth there found only suffocation. Yet one boy, no older than 10, stood at the edge of a pool, staring into the rippling surface. He saw his reflection scattered into 100 pieces. When the roof fell, he was still looking at it, a fragment of sky where none remained. By evening, the air had grown colder. The mountain's fire dimmed, hidden by its own smoke. But the ash did not stop. It thickened until doorways became slopes, until courtyards filled like wells. People sank where they stood, some sitting, some kneeling, some reaching upward as if to touch light that was no longer there. They did not fall violently. They simply settled, as if lying down to rest. Among them were gestures that would outlast centuries. A mother shielding her child, a man covering his mouth, a woman clutching jewelry that glittered even in the dark. They did not know they were becoming statues, that the dust, embracing them, would one day keep their shape. In their stillness, there was no agony now, only the surrender of the living to the weight of earth and air. The final tremor came near midnight. It rolled through the ground like the sigh of something immense exhaling for the last time. Roofs collapsed in slow motion, walls folded inward. A wave of fine ash followed, rising like mist before settling once more. Then the sound faded, first the thunder, then the wind, then the falling stone. Even the mountain grew silent, its fury spent. When the silence finally arrived, it was complete. Pompeii lay beneath 15 feet of ash, a perfect outline of what had been. The fire on Vesuvius still glowed faintly, painting the clouds with a dying red, the last light of a world that would not see dawn again. Far above the buried city, the smoke thinned and the stars reappeared, cold, distant, unblinking. They looked down on a landscape smoothed by death, serene in its stillness. And if there were any who still breathed, they saw that calm sky and mistook it, perhaps, for peace. The night grew quiet. Ash drifted downward like endless snow, covering every trace of movement, every shape of sorrow. The last light faded from the mountain, and the earth closed its eyes. Part 6. When silence claimed the city. When the roaring finally stopped, it was not replaced by peace, but by something stranger. A silence so deep it seemed to swallow thought itself. The air no longer trembled. The mountain no longer glowed. The world had paused, as though holding its breath after a long cry. The wind fell still. The ash descended without sound, and Pompeii lay hidden beneath its new skin of dust, a city asleep under stone. The silence was heavy, almost warm. It pressed against what was left of the walls, seeped into doorways, and filled every corner where life had once stirred. No birds, no voices, no footsteps. Only the faint settling of ash, as if the sky were slowly finishing its sentence. Under that pale layer, streets and bodies, statues and tools, bread in ovens and rings on fingers, all rested together, equal now. The world above kept turning, unaware that an entire city had just fallen out of time. Hours passed, or perhaps days. There was no way to tell. The ash cooled and hardened, sealing Pompeii in a crust of grey stone. Beneath it, the air grew thin and cold, yet the outlines of things remained. The bodies left hollow spaces that would one day tell their story. The beds kept the shape of sleep. Frescoes still clung to the walls, their colors trapped in darkness. A cat lay curled beside a door, its spine arched in a silent dream. Everything was still, yet nothing was gone. Above the buried city, the slopes of Vesuvius smoldered faintly. The black cloud that had crowned it drifted away in slow motion, spreading into the sky like ink diluted by time. Rain came at last, gentle, hesitant, and turned the ash to pale mud. It flowed down the mountainside, over vineyards that no longer existed, into a sea that had grown cold and gray. The rain erased footprints, filled cracks, and softened the land, until even tragedy looked calm. From the distance of the bay, sailors later said, the mountain seemed to sleep again, innocent and still. No one could approach. The air was thick with dust, the water lined with floating stone. They waited on their ships, staring toward the shore, whispering names that would never answer. When dawn came, they saw only a smooth field of ash where the city had been, not even ruins, only silence shaped like memory. Some believed the gods had lifted Pompeii into the heavens. Others thought it swallowed whole by the sea. But the truth was simpler. It had not vanished. It had merely paused. Underground, the stillness deepened. The temperature dropped. Moisture condensed on plaster and bronze. Colors faded more slowly than life. A ring slipped from a finger and lay in dust that would not be disturbed for centuries. The ash hardened above like the lid of a coffin, and the weight of the world pressed down, compacting time into a single layer. Everything beneath remained intact. The gestures, the meals, the laughter turned to stone. Sometimes the earth shivered again, a faint aftershock passing through the hardened layers. It sounded like distant thunder, but no one was left to listen. Vesuvius slept once more, smoke drifting from its rim like the sigh of a beast too tired to hunt. The sun returned, burning across a landscape emptied of color. Wildflowers sprouted on the new soil, roots sinking into what had once been marble and tile. Nature, patient as ever, began the slow work of covering what had already been forgotten. In this new silence, centuries began. Rain fell, seasons turned, and vines grew again over the buried roofs. Generations of farmers planted and harvested above the lost city, unaware of what lay beneath their feet. The mountain stayed quiet, a monument to its own violence. At night, the wind moved softly across the fields, carrying with it a faint scent of ash that no one could name. The sea healed first. Waves smoothed the shoreline, washing away the black sand and replacing it with bright new grains. Fishermen returned, casting nets where fire had once fallen. They told stories of the old city, of statues still buried and voices trapped in stone. Children grew up hearing those tales and laughed, thinking them myths. Pompeii became a rumor, then a legend, then silence again. And yet, under 15 feet of ash, the city endured. Walls held their murals. Pots still stood on stoves. Doors, though sealed, waited. It was as if Pompeii itself had chosen not to die but to sleep, perfectly preserved in the act of living. In the darkness beneath the ground, the shape of a life, the angle of a wrist, the curve of a smile, lingered longer than memory. The silence became not emptiness, but echo. Above, grass began to grow in thin patches. Goats grazed where once stood the baths. Rainwater carved shallow channels across the hardened earth, marking where streets had been. The wind carried seeds, dust, and the faintest whisper of what lay below, a whisper that could not yet be heard, but would one day call men back to dig, to uncover, to remember. For now, though, the land slept, and under its weight, Pompeii dreamed quietly, caught forever between breath and stone. The mountain watched over it all, dark, majestic, indifferent. Its shadow stretched each evening across the silent plain. To those who passed nearby, nothing seemed unusual. A quiet hill, a sleeping earth, a memory buried too deep to touch. But beneath that calm surface, the city still glowed faintly in its tomb, holding within it the last heartbeat of an ancient day. And as centuries folded over centuries, the silence of Pompeii deepened into eternity. Part 7. A city made of memory. For nearly 17 centuries, Pompeii lay hidden beneath the earth. Its streets turned to stone, its voices folded into silence. The mountain above grew green again. Olive trees covered its slopes. Vineyards returned. Seasons came and went in their patient rhythm, rains softening the hardened ash into soil. New villages rose nearby, unaware that they stood upon the bones of another. Even the memory of Pompeii faded into myth, a whisper passed by fishermen and travelers who spoke of a cursed field where nothing sang. And then, one day, the ground gave up a secret. It began quietly, as such things always do. A farmer digging a trench for water struck something solid, not rock, not root, but a curve of stone too smooth to be natural. He cleared the soil with his hands and found what looked like a wall, painted faintly with red. At first, he thought it was part of an old Roman farmstead, one of many scattered ruins across Campania. But as he followed the line downward, the colors deepened and shapes began to appear. Vines, faces, columns, gods. The earth, after centuries of silence, had started to speak. Words spread slowly, carried from one village to another. Scholars came, priests came, soldiers came, each armed with curiosity and shovels. They did not yet know the name of what they had found. They called it simply La Civita, the buried place. Under layers of hardened ash, the first rooms emerged, frescoed walls, marble steps, mosaics glinting with gold dust, coins, tools, pottery, the delicate bones of a meal half-eaten. It was as though time had stopped mid-breath and waited for them to arrive. When the first skeleton appeared, bent in its final gesture, a hush fell over the diggers. They had seen ruins before, temples, tombs, forgotten palaces, but never this. These were not relics of conquest or ceremony. These were moments of life, caught and kept. A cup still resting on a table, a ring still circling a bone-thin finger, the mark of a hand pressed into ash, as if waving from another century. They dug carefully now, with reverence. Each object seemed to hold a voice, each wall a breath. Some workers refused to continue after dusk, saying they heard whispers through the dust. But the scholars stayed. By torchlight, they traced Latin inscriptions still legible on stone. Salve, welcome, veil, farewell. The words of a world that had never expected to be found. As the years passed, the buried city revealed itself like a painting restored inch by inch. Rooms connected to rooms, streets to squares. The amphitheater returned, then the baths, then the fountains that once sang beneath sunlight. They found bread still round in its oven, jars of olives still sealed, and bodies, or rather, the spaces where bodies had been. When plaster was poured into those hollows, human shapes emerged, detailed to the fold of cloth and curl of hair. The diggers stepped back, shaken. The dead had faces again. No discovery in the world had ever been so intimate. Ruins spoke of glory. Pompeii spoke of breath. It showed not just how Romans ruled, but how they lived, how they ate, slept, loved, and feared. Children's toys, painted dice, graffiti, declaring affection or insult, traces of dogs' paws across wet tiles. Each artifact whispered, "We were here." Each cast of a body seemed to echo, "We remember." The scholars named it at last. This was Pompeii, the city of legend, the one swallowed by Vesuvius in the year of the great emperor Titus. What had been myth became geography again, and with it came awe. Poets wrote of it. Travelers came from across Europe to walk its uncovered streets. Kings sent expeditions. Artists sketched the frescoes. philosophers pondered the meaning of a city caught between death and eternity. And still, the digging went on, year after year, as if humanity could not stop searching for its own reflection in the ash. The world above changed faster now. Revolutions, inventions, machines. But beneath the surface, Pompeii remained slow, patient, half awake. Every wall they touched seemed to breathe dust that glittered in the light. Even the smell of the place lingered. Damp stone, earth, faint sulfur, a sweetness like old wine. To walk there was to feel time bend, each footstep landing on both past and present. It was said that visitors left quieter than they arrived, as if the silence below had followed them home. By the 19th century, the city had become a living museum. Walkways were built, columns straightened, roofs patched. Yet for all the care, the air of sanctity remained. The plaster figures, mothers, slaves, children, lovers, stood frozen in gestures too human to forget. Guides whispered their stories to tourists, softening their voices out of respect. Each figure was a question more than an answer. What did they feel in that last moment? Did they know? Did they forgive the sky? Archaeologists recorded every inch, yet some things defied record. A single footprint in the ash, leading nowhere. A bronze key beside a locked chest that no one had opened. A tablet bearing the unfinished sketch of a mountain. It was as if Pompeii had left its own messages, half legible, daring time to misread them. In the quiet of evening, when workers left and the sun slanted across the broken walls, the city seemed alive again. A shadow would stretch over a doorway as if someone were about to return home. A breeze would pass through a colonnade, carrying dust that sparkled like breath. The silence was no longer empty now. It was inhabited, full of presence. Pompeii had become not just a ruin, but a memory given shape. Above it all, Vesuvius stood calm and green, its slopes bright with vineyards and flowers. The same mountain, the same silence. Only now, humanity listened. Part 8. The faces beneath the dust. The first faces appeared by accident. A worker digging near a crumbled wall struck something hollow. Not stone, not wood, but a pocket of air sealed for centuries. When they cleared the opening, they found the impression of a body, delicate and exact, the curve of a shoulder, the fall of hair, the shape of fingers still clutching at nothing. To preserve it, they poured plaster into the cavity. Hours later, when the mold hardened and the earth was peeled away, a person returned. The workers stepped back in silence. It was not the grandeur of a statue. It was the stillness of sleep made solid. Soon, there were more. Every dig revealed another gesture. A mother with her child, a man shielding his face, a young girl kneeling as if in prayer. They rose one by one from the ash, pale and fragile, their forms half human, half dream. The plaster caught every wrinkle, every fold of fabric, even the impression of teeth behind parted lips. It was not art, yet it felt sacred. Each cast was a moment made eternal, a fragment of terror transformed into peace. The archaeologists treated them with reverence. They moved slowly, brushing dust from shoulders as though waking the dead gently. One wrote in his notebook that Pompeii was not a ruin, but a heartbeat paused. Another described the figures as ghosts with weight. They seemed to carry an emotion that no fresco or inscription could. The quiet dignity of people caught between life and oblivion, and yet, standing among them, one could not help but feel both awe and guilt, as if intruding upon something private, something meant only for the earth to hold. In the soft light of late afternoon, the figures seemed almost to breathe. The air shimmered with dust motes, tiny sparks drifting through the golden sunbeams. Some of the casts had collapsed, their plaster cracked by time, but the faces endured. Eyebrows arched, mouths parted, hands reached outward toward an invisible light. It was as though, in dying, they had preserved the exact shape of reaching for life. Visitors began to come from across Europe. They approached quietly, hats in hand, their footsteps echoing on the stone paths. In the silence of those vaulted rooms, they looked into the faces of the long dead and saw themselves. A woman wept softly before the cast of a child. A poet wrote that Pompeii was a mirror polished by fire. Even emperors stood speechless, humbled before the frozen gestures of ordinary people. It was not the power of empire they saw here, but its fragility. The casts were arranged in chambers and gardens, sheltered beneath wooden roofs. Rain drummed on the planks above, while the figures below gleamed, pale and smooth. They lay in rows, some curled, some standing, their shadows stretching long under the lanterns. Each one told a story without words. This woman might have been a baker's wife, this man a sailor, that child a dream never finished. None had names, yet every face carried the weight of all names. Over time, scholars began to study them in detail, measuring, sketching, tracing. They found jewelry pressed into the plaster, sandals preserved down to their stitching. Coins clung to the folds of a tunic, frozen mid-fall. Even the pattern of linen left its mark on the skin. The people of Pompeii had not simply vanished. They had been translated into texture, into form. In this strange new eternity, they were both human and monument. But it was the expressions that lingered longest. No two were the same. Some looked calm, almost serene, as if drifting into sleep. Others seemed caught mid-breath, their mouths open in surprise or plea. A few turned their faces away, shielding their eyes from the final light. There was no horror in them now, only the ache of recognition, the reminder that every life, however ordinary, ends in stillness. To look at them was to feel time fold inward. At dusk, the city grew quiet again. The tourists left, their footsteps fading beyond the gates. The wind returned, carrying the scent of cypress and dust. Between the ruins, the plaster faces watched the sky darken. A bird landed briefly on one of their shoulders, then lifted off, leaving no mark. And for a moment, it seemed that the line between living and dead had grown very thin indeed. When the moon rose, pale and steady, it cast silver light over the sleeping forms. Their shadows pooled together, merging into one long shape across the floor. Somewhere in the distance, the sea murmured softly, the same sea that had watched the city die. The waves broke and retreated, their rhythm unchanged by centuries. In that faint echo, the plaster figures seemed to listen. The archaeologists often said the bodies of Pompeii were not mummies, but memories. They did not decay, they persisted. And perhaps that persistence was the truest kind of survival. For while the flesh was gone, the gesture remained, the way a hand reached for another, the turn of a head, the slight bend of a knee. It was as if the human spirit had left its final signature in ash, a signature no time could erase. Above them, Vesuvius loomed quiet and green, its slopes peaceful beneath the stars. The mountain that had once devoured the city now stood as its guardian. Its shadow reached across the ruins, covering both the living and the dead in the same soft darkness. And in that darkness, the faces beneath the dust seemed to glow faintly, not with fear, but with something gentler, something like forgiveness. Part 9. Pompeii reborn. By the dawn of the 18th century, the silence of Pompeii had already begun to stir beneath the weight of centuries. Europe was restless, hungry for discovery, for wonder, for proof that time could be undone. When word spread that an entire Roman city was emerging from beneath the earth, artists, nobles, and dreamers came from every direction. They stood before the unearthed walls in awe, as if witnessing a resurrection. The ash that once buried the city now yielded its treasures, and the world above, weary of its own wars and empires, found in Pompeii a mirror of what it might lose. The excavations grew organized, deliberate. Tents rose along the hillsides, Carts carried fragments of marble and fresco to makeshift shelters. Every discovery felt like revelation: a fresco uncovered, a statue lifted whole, a street traced back to light after 2,000 years of night. Men in powdered wigs knelt in the dust, brushing away soil with trembling hands. They were not only unearthing objects, they were touching the pulse of an ancient heartbeat. Soon, the artifacts began to travel. Bronze lamps, mosaics, cups, and rings found their way to Naples, then to royal collections in Vienna and Paris. Painters filled sketchbooks with ruins and faces. Poets wrote verses about a city that had died beautifully. Musicians composed pieces meant to sound like falling ash, like fire remembered through sound. Pompeii became an obsession, not just a ruin, but a story, a lesson, a warning whispered through the corridors of art. The world called it rebirth, yet it was not the city that lived again. It was memory itself. People began to see history not as a distant legend, but as something tactile, something buried just beneath the soil of their own lives. The ruins spoke softly. We were once as you are, and humanity listened, humbled by its own reflection. In every cracked wall and frozen gesture, people saw the same frailty that lingered in their own hearts. Pompeii was not a ruin of the Romans. It was a ruin of being human. Writers flocked to describe it. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe wandered its streets in the late 1700s and wrote that he could almost hear the footsteps of the ancients beside him. Charles Dickens called it a place where life has been fixed in its final hour, like a melody caught in a single note. Mary Shelley, haunted by both science and loss, wrote that Pompeii's stillness felt more alive than any living city. Each saw in the ash a kind of truth, that beauty and death were not opposites, but partners in the dance of time. Artists began to paint Pompeii not as destruction, but as dream. In glowing oils they imagined marble columns under crimson skies, lovers parting amid falling fire. The mountain's flame turned poetic. Archaeologists, too, saw art in the act of uncovering, each layer of earth peeled away like pages of a long-lost manuscript. The city became a canvas for the living imagination, its stillness inspiring creation in every form. Even those who had never seen it began to dream of it. A ghost city bathed in perpetual dusk, where nothing ages and nothing leaves. The study of archaeology itself was reborn in Pompeii's shadow. For the first time, scholars realized that history was not just the story of kings and wars, but of rooms, tools, and footprints. The ordinary became sacred: a loaf of bread, a cooking pot, a child's bronze bracelet. Museums began to rise, quiet temples of glass and stone where fragments of Pompeii rested under soft light. Visitors walked through the exhibits whispering, as if still afraid to disturb the city's sleep. Even now, in those halls, the hush feels ancient. Pompeii's rediscovery spread beyond academia. Cities across Europe rebuilt themselves in imitation of its architecture: the columns, the courtyards, the symmetry of calm. Painters filled salons with scenes of the eruption, finding in ruin a strange elegance. Writers compared their own fleeting empires to the one frozen beneath the ash. Philosophers used Pompeii to remind the living of impermanence, and travelers, countless travelers, came to walk the streets where time had stopped, leaving their own footprints beside those carved in stone 2 millennia before. Yet, amid this fascination, there was always unease. For every fresco admired, a shadow lingered. The figures in plaster, those who had died, became spectacles. Their tragedy turned into curiosity. Tourists gazed into their faces, sometimes with reverence, sometimes with a shiver of thrill. And though the scholars labeled them casts, the silence in those chambers remained heavier than words. Even celebration could not erase the sorrow beneath. Pompeii had returned to the world, but it had brought its stillness with it. Still, people could not stay away. They came seeking beauty and found truth. In Pompeii, time was no longer an abstract thing. It was something you could touch, something that pressed against your fingertips and reminded you of your own fragility. Standing beneath the open sky, among walls that remembered laughter, one felt the nearness of both life and its absence. The past, it seemed, had not died at all. It had simply changed its form, waiting for eyes willing to see it. When night fell over the ruins, the torches flickered against painted walls. The colors glowed again, deep red, soft gold, the same hues the Pompeians had once known. The shadows of visitors mingled with those of the ancient dead, long and wavering across the ground. Above, Vesuvius loomed, silent and green under the moon. And in that shared quiet, the difference between centuries vanished. It was easy to believe that the city still breathed beneath the dust, dreaming of itself. Pompeii had been buried, forgotten, remembered, and reborn, not as it was, but as what it meant. It taught the world that nothing truly disappears, that under every layer of loss lies a trace of warmth, of presence, of life paused mid-breath. And perhaps that is why people keep returning, because in Pompeii they recognize the most ancient truth of all, that even when the world ends, beauty remains. Part 10. Ashes that remember, even now, 2,000 years later, the air in Pompeii feels different. It moves more slowly, as if weighted by memory. You can walk its streets in silence and still hear the faint rhythm of life that once filled them. Footsteps echoing off stone, a merchant's call carried by wind, the rustle of linen as someone passed too close. The sound has faded, but the shape remains. Every wall, every shadow remembers. The sky above is bright again. Vesuvius rises quiet and green, its slopes covered in vineyards. Children run along paths that were once buried under 15 feet of ash. The city lies open now, half ruin, half dream. Rooms exposed to sun and rain, mosaics glittering in the afternoon light. Grass grows through the cracks in marble. In some doorways, birds have built nests where once hung bronze bells. And yet, amid the breeze and the hum of insects, there is a stillness that never leaves. Visitors move softly here. They speak in whispers, as if the dust might listen. Some carry cameras, others notebooks, but most simply walk, eyes wide, their breath unsteady. They pass through houses that still hold color, deep reds, faded blues, the gold of forgotten gods. A bowl sits on a table as though waiting. A loaf of bread, blackened to stone, rests in an oven. A dog is curled in the threshold, his ribs caught in eternity. In Pompeii, the smallest things feel infinite. What makes it haunting is not death, but presence. Here, nothing is gone. Everything has paused. The people who lived, who joked, who argued, who loved, they are all here, beneath a thin layer of time. Their gestures remain, their laughter floats faintly between the walls, their words linger in scratches carved into plaster. "Come to me," one reads. Another says, "Life is short, drink wine." The irony is too human to bear, and yet it brings a strange comfort. Pompeii does not warn, it reminds. At sunset, the city turns gold. Light slides across columns and broken statues, softening them until they seem alive again. The air smells faintly of dust and lemon leaves. Somewhere, a guide's voice fades into the wind. 2,000 souls lived here. But as the shadows lengthen, it's hard to believe they're gone. The place hums with quiet energy, the same pulse that moved through it before the ash fell. You can almost feel it in the ground, a heartbeat under stone. Historians call Pompeii a tragedy, but standing here, it feels more like a conversation across time. The people who were lost left no last words, yet through their houses and their faces in plaster, they speak still. They teach us that beauty is temporary, but so is loss. That even ruin can become a kind of grace. When you touch the walls, warm from the day's sun, you realize they are not cold tombs. They are memories you can hold. At night, when the tourists are gone, and the moon climbs over the ridge of Vesuvius, the city grows quiet again. Torches flicker near the Forum. The wind sighs through the empty doorways. The shadows stretch across the pavements where chariots once passed. If you stand very still, you might hear a faint ringing, like a dropped coin or a distant bell. Echoes of the old world still finding their way through stone. It is easy to forget where you are in time. Pompeii does that. It folds the centuries until the present feels ancient and the ancient feels alive. The archaeologists still dig, though carefully now. Each spadeful of soil reveals something small, a coin, a comb, a child's footprint. They work not to conquer the past, but to listen to it. The city reveals itself slowly, as if choosing what to remember. Sometimes, when the morning light falls through a gap in a wall, dust dances in the beam, small, weightless, eternal. In those moments, Pompeii seems to exhale. The earth releases its story one breath at a time. There is poetry in the way ruin becomes refuge. In the cracks of marble, flowers bloom. In the ashes of tragedy, birds make their nests. And above all, in the silence of what was lost, there is still song. Not loud, not mournful, just steady, like a whisper carried by the wind. The same wind that once blew through the markets, that now stirs the leaves over ancient courtyards. Time, it seems, is not a line, but a circle, and Pompeii is where it closes. As you leave the city, the mountain looms behind you, its shadow stretching long across the plain. It watches as it always has, silent, patient, unchanged. The road curves downward toward the sea, and for a moment you catch a glimpse of the bay glittering in the sun. You can almost imagine ships on the horizon, sails white against the blue, the same sight the Pompeians once knew before the sky broke open. The air smells of salt and dust, of endings and beginnings intertwined. Pompeii is no longer a city of death. It is a city of remembrance. Its streets are veins of memory, carrying the pulse of every life that passed through them, and when the wind shifts, you can almost hear them, a murmur of voices beneath the dust, laughing, talking, living still. They are not ghosts. They are echoes of what it means to be human, fragile, brilliant, endlessly curious. And so the story ends where it began, under the shadow of Vesuvius and the soft light of an Italian dawn. A city sleeps, a mountain dreams, and time itself stands quietly between them. Pompeii endures, not as ruin, not as warning, but as reminder that all things fade, that all things remain. If you enjoy drifting through this piece of the past, maybe leave a like, or simply let the story carry you to sleep. And if you'd like to hear more quiet journeys like this one, you can subscribe, but only if it feels right. Thank you for listening. The world remembers you.